Center's new initiative on cooperative economics, which has been developed over the course of this past year with the help and leadership and guidance of our advisory committee, which includes Diane Fugino of UCSB's Asian American Studies Department, Utacha Chattopadhyay from the History Department, and Casey Walsh of the Department of Anthropology. All three of them will be co-moderating tonight, so you'll be hearing more from them in just a few minutes. We're also putting this workshop on with the help and guidance of Nick Cohen, who's a graduate student in history and who's assisting with the project, as well as Joanne Nowak, the Blum Center's academic coordinator, who makes everything we do possible. That's just the one thing I always have to say about Joanne. So thanks to everyone for helping us in putting this event on. Now, I also want to note that tonight's workshop, and I'm really pleased to see so many people who are returning for this second event that we're having, because tonight's workshop is a follow-up and a continuation, really, of what we hope becomes an ongoing public conversation that we started a few weeks ago with what I just would characterize as a truly invigorating and reverberating keynote address by Professor Jessica Gordon-Nemhart, and the really great follow-up discussion that it started. We have, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, we have panelists to guide our discussion tonight, and and with them, let me just say a few things about our plan, which is to start out with them with a discussion of, well, I guess I'd say what we've learned from both scholarship and experience about the broad aims and some of the real central dilemmas of various efforts to make cooperation a defining principle of economic, but also of social life. And after we talk about some of those big issues, big questions that absorb folks who care and are engaged in cooperative economics, we'll turn to focus more specifically on the role of research, study, and knowledge building in creating and sustaining cooperative endeavors. And as we're doing that, we hope we plan to talk about some more specific questions and issues that are in need of further research. When we get to that part, we'll be drawing on questions and issues that many of you submitted via the workshop RSVP. And then we'll also, when we get to that part of the discussion, we'll draw on questions that you submit via the chat. And so please do that as we're going along. As you have questions that you'd like to see us discuss, especially having to do with research and building a collaborative research agenda, please submit those via the chat box. Throughout all of this, we really want to encourage all of you to think about and invite you to think about submitting a proposal for the Blum Center's new grant program, Researching Cooperative Economics. The call for proposals has been in circulation for several weeks now. It's also on the Blum Center website, and we can include a link to it in the Zoom chat box, so please do check it out. Although I'm getting a message, Joanne just put it out in the chat box, but I'm getting a message that the chat box might not be working, so we'll work on that as we're proceeding. So a last quick note before I introduce our panelists, just for the panel discussion part of the workshop, I'd ask that you please mute your mics and your cameras so that we can spotlight the speakers as we're going along. Okay, now I'm going to, first of all, I really want to offer a warm welcome to everyone and especially to our panelists. I will give very brief introductions of everyone. Every single one of our panelists could, it deserves a much longer introduction, but in the interest of time, I'll just briefly introduce them and invite you to check out our website where we have a bit more biographical information about each of them. I want to welcome back Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who was our fabulous opening keynote speaker. She's the author of Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice, and a proud 2016 inductee into the U.S. Cooperative Hall of Fame. She's a professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College at City University of New York. Dr. Amico Saldivar is a Mexican sociologist, and she's currently a lecturer at UCSB in the Department of Anthropology. Her work focuses on race, ethnicity, mestizaje, and anti-racism and research activism in Mexico and Latin America. In 2010, she co-founded the Colectivo para Eliminar el Racismo, or Coopera, which is a Mexican anti-racist collective. Annalise Llewellyn is on the faculty of UCSB's Department of East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies. Her research focuses on transnational civil society, environmental justice, embodiment, and indigenous communities in contemporary Japan and across Asia. And Marcelina Sepulveda is the executive director for Santa Barbara Student Housing Cooperative and a board member of NASCO Development Services. He is also currently active in Cooperation Santa Barbara, which is a local mutual aid organization that's committed to advancing economic democracy in our area. So those are our panelists. We're going to start out, I'm going to start out with an opening general question, asking each of our panelists to take a few minutes, about 5 minutes, to situate, each of you, I'll ask you to situate yourself and your work in relation to the study of cooperation in economic life, whether it's as research scholars, as participant observers, as cooperation organizers, or some combination of the above, and to share any opening thoughts that you have about the significance of cooperative economics, both as a field of research and social action. I'm going to start with Jessica.
Thanks so much. Thanks. I'm happy to be back again. And thanks to those of you who came back and think I might have something more to say. So yes, I am a co-op researcher, a co-op educator, and a co-op advocate. What I mean by each of those three things is, as a researcher, I look into both understanding best practices and documenting the existence of cooperatives, but also trying to figure out better ways to actually study the benefits and impacts of cooperatives, particularly on communities. I got interested in this work because when I became an economist, I wanted to use economics to help solve the problems of economic inequality and economic injustice. And I was searching for, alternative strategies and how to reduce the stranglehold of neoclassical traditional capitalist economics on solutions, humane solutions to inequality and discrimination. And so when I came upon the co-op model, first I was sort of taught about it. Actually, I didn't realize that I had grown up in a co-op. I wasn't thinking of it as the same way as the co-ops I started studying. But anyway, when I first was introduced to it academically, it seemed like it was just something European and European Americans did. But I learned, because I was focused on African American development, that it was actually something that everybody practices and that African Americans have a long history. I also started organizing, especially the worker co-op movement, making sure that we had pulled people together who were doing worker co-ops to share best practices and so I helped to create the U.S. I hope to co-found the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. And then I've been also trying to teach about cooperative economics. Oh, no bell yet, so I could talk a little bit longer. So why is this significant? Well, as I said, partly I was happy to find the model as an adult as a solution to economic inequality. I also, the more I studied it and the more I realized how misunderstood it was, I also now, in the 21st century, in the era of Black Lives Matter, can also state unequivocally that cooperative economics, and I actually combine it with solidarity economics, which is a little bit broader and a little bit more stronger principles about democracy and economic democracy and economic justice and non-hierarchy and non-exploitation within the way we do our economics. So I talk about cooperative solidarity economics, and I argue now that it actually is a way to understand how we can achieve racial justice, that we really can't achieve racial justice just politically and socially. We have to add the economic democracy part, and cooperatives and solidarity economics are two great ways to add economic democracy. And unfortunately, we can't really achieve economic democracy without addressing racism either. So we've got to do it all simultaneously and intersectionally. But I think it also helps to give a better perspective on both the challenges, but also the possible solutions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Let me turn now to Marcelino to ask him to tell us more about his engagement with cooperatives.
Everybody, good to be here with you today. So yeah, I'm the executive director for the Santa Barbara Student Housings. We are located in Isla Vista, and we currently have one house in Santa Barbara, and Nick, who works with the Bloom Center, is one of our participants today, and he has been the board treasurer for our board of directors in the past year. Previous to my work with Santa Barbara Student Housing, I also was a manager at the Isla Vista Food Co-op back when I was a UCSB student, and that was my introduction to cooperatives. And I also have a connection to NASCO, which is the National Association of Student Cooperatives, Student Housing Cooperatives. And I also work with another organization called Sociocracy for All, and there is a cooperatives circle within Sociocracy for All. And so I am networked in with international cooperatives on that circle. And that's been a really interesting perspective to compare notes on how co-ops are working in the UK and across the US as well. If I would say that my research is anywhere, it is really about best practices. It's really looking at what are the best practices for a cooperative. As a cooperative is born, what does it need to have in place in order to develop itself into a sustainable business? Oftentimes I find that the venture for the co-op is a really terrific idea. We want to create this alternative space outside of capitalism where we can experience a taste of liberation. And there's all these social justice implications to it, and they're super important. But the structure itself is still a business and needs to operate in relationship to capitalism and to all the regulating agencies. So how do cooperatives do this? How do we run a business collectively while being member driven, while having that membership turn over, in my case, like every year, every 2 years? What kind of educational systems do you build in order to really sustain this organization over the long term? So it's a really challenging dynamic. There's a lot of tensions in here between the population that we're working with and where they're at in their lives and what they have to be responsible for. How do we divide up the responsibilities among the membership? Who's going to be the board treasurer? Who's going to, ensure that there's transparency to the finances? All these things that are really essential to a business now have to be held in community, and a level of experience and knowledge has to be brought forth, which allows for leadership development across the membership. And but it is a challenge. It is a very real challenge. So that's where my interest is. Check.
Great. Thank you so much. Amiko?
Well, thank you for having me here. And I am unmuted. Yes. So, well, I do not do research on cooperatives, and I'm still wondering what I'm doing here. And because I will talk about a collective that I founded or co-founded 10 years ago. And I think it's more about, well, the reason that this collective was founded thinking about how can we end racism. That's a little task in hand. And it was clear that this had to be such a complex process, challenge. And so it was funded with the idea of collective. We don't use cooperative, but the name ends up being coopera, which in Spanish would be cooperar. That was the idea. And even when we were thinking about the name, we wanted that tone of being in a collective to acknowledge that this is such a big problem that affects all of us, and that we need definitely a collaborative, collective process of thinking through it. So what I can say economically, I mean, I can just tell a little thing that just happened to us. We've been around for 10 years, but finally we decided, and this was a long debate, that, at the beginning, a lot of the members didn't want to do it. And now we decided to be officially registered and have an account and, have a fiscal responsibility. And today we were just announced that we were not granted the right to become officially registered. And the reason is, and this is like the complex of economics, when economics comes into it, because the person whose address was given, she's an indigenous woman. She lives in a small town, and the bank agent went to her house and asked her, "Where is your office?" So she's like, "Well, I don't have an office." And so therefore they consider that she doesn't have an office, therefore she cannot be an NGO. So we were denied all the right to be legal, and but I mean, it shows, it's just an example of what happened when you're trying to do something that is not quite fit to how the system wants you to work. So I mean, this just happened, and it's interesting. I mean, it's a whole political context around it. But so what I can say is what we've done and what we figured out in these 10 years is how to build a system that it is collaborative and that is democratic, and that everybody has that we will really put in place a system that goes through process. Like that we build a process where people can move, knowing that the issue of ending racism is very complex. And one of the goals of our organization, and we're very successful, is that we work very diverse. This is the only organization in Mexico that works against racism. Until a year ago, that another one popped up, and it's the only one that is led by an indigenous, Black, and Asian woman team. So, and there are mestizos and there are whites and there are other, but we really try to figure out how can we work together. And so there's something about understanding that we are all on this. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Before asking Annalise to jump in, I will say it is a little bit ironic that in the time of pandemic, when everybody has been working outside of an office, that this is the thing they called you on. So, but very telling that they did that. Yeah. Annalise, I think you have some slides you want to share. Is that correct?
I do. Can you allow share screen? Thank you. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, just very briefly, I'm going to turn on my timer so I don't go over. I just wanted to, well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me, and Haku. I raise my hands to the people of Shimowich and this land of the Chumash, the coastal Chumash community, where I'm a guest and have been a guest for about 13 years. Very grateful to all of you and to our Chumash relatives here. So I just wanted to give some framing comments. I can say a little bit more about my own research process later on. Hopefully there'll be time. But I'm not an economist, and this is brand new to me. So I wanted to think about this from the perspective of Indigenous relationships of exchange, because I think we can learn a lot from the ethics that undergirds those relationships. So I'm going to kind of go way back, but also remind us that this is a living system that still continues today. And there's so much we have to learn. And in fact, I would argue that our very survival as a species and our co-survival with other species is completely dependent on us decolonizing and recognizing the way that we all live together. So for Indigenous communities, exchange involves expectations of reciprocity, right? And I think that is a key word for many sort of notions of cooperative economics, the way I understand it. And so I want to, of course, be very careful and recognize that Indigenous peoples are incredibly diverse and they have a distinct relationship with place and history, and we cannot put them all in one basket. We need to be very careful about the sort of mysticism of the ecologically noble savage. I think all of that is very, very dangerous. But there are some shared features of Indigenous ontologies that impact the way they understand exchange. So in general, Indigenous logics are based on a different understanding of exchange from state capitalism, neoliberalism, or even state models of socialism or communism, right? So they generally operate from an ethic of care, which means that they recognize other sentient beings, which we can call them more than humans, as valued members of any exchange relationship. So that is the animals, the fish, the plants, the soil, and even the atmosphere are valued, are understood as sentient beings upon whom the impact of economic exchange must be understood. And so, for example, the decision to blast carbon emissions or submerge high-level radioactive waste in a sacred mountain, or to release radioactive water from Fukushima into the ocean, this has major consequences for the survival of your own Indigenous community, but for the planet as a whole. So I want to say something about biodiversity, because I think that's the other piece of Indigenous relationships of exchange. 5% of the world's population that is Indigenous caretakes 80% of the global biodiversity on 20% of the world's land and water. This is an incredible set of statistics. As we know, or as we may know, Indigenous peoples comprise about 370 million of the world's population. And for them, the treaties that they've signed with settler colonial occupiers and or the relationships under the Indian Constitution, for example, in the context where I work, this is not just an agreement between humans and humans, it's humans and the more than humans beings in the land. So it's a different kind of legal compact upon which that agreement is based. So when we put an ethic of care at the center, those who are involved in these relationships must incorporate a longitudinal view. We have to understand how the ancestral guidance positioned us here, and also how whatever the agreement of exchange, whatever decision is being taken is going to impact many generations into the future, not just us, depending upon how we decide. So this is the key point about biodiversity. And then secondly, I want to say something about redistribution. Okay, so this is actually a Khasi woman in northeastern India, and she has made a decision to refuse a uranium mining project on her land, even though she was offered roughly $5 million US, and her community does not even have electricity nor a school. Another way of thinking about redistribution, this is the Indigenous Ainu community. And for them, a key part of their annual ceremony is the bear spirit sending ceremony. These are historical photos because this ceremony was banned at the end of the 20th century. And so that's why these are sort of older photos. But the logic here is that the entire community benefits from sharing of all of the parts of the bear, but also the community benefits from this wonderful sort of treat ceremony where they stand on the roof and throw out gifts of grains to the entire community. And then final example I'll show is from Northeast India. This was during the COVID lockdowns last year. I realize I'm over time, so I'll stop. But this is a moment when the community both distributed masks and grains to folks who were without any source of food. So I'll end there, and I look forward to chatting more later. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
Well, it was so compelling, and I really appreciate those images. And yes, let's make sure we return to some of those themes as we go along. Diane, I'm going to turn to you now. Diane has some questions about to pick up on this question of racial justice. Go ahead,
Yes, everything that everyone spoke about leads to this next set of questions, which, as Alice just said, is about racial justice. And often, right, when people think about cooperative economics, it isn't always linked to ideas of racial and intersectional justice, and yet it needs to be if it's going to be successful, right? If we're going to succeed, if we're really going to have equitable distribution. And so my question is, if I'm wondering, and Annalise got into some of this, right? How different knowledge systems, such as indigenous epistemologies and the Black radical epistemologies, help us to think about cooperative economics. And also a second question, and so folks can just jump in, about ways in which cooperatives have actively sought racial justice, as well as the development of cooperative economics, and challenges to that as well. So I'm happy for anybody to jump in and respond to kind of the ways that we link racial and economic justice.
I guess everyone's waiting for me to start.
Please, Jessica.
It is one of my specialties, but I didn't want to hog the stage. But I'll start. So, and I'll try to be quick, but it's difficult. 20 years of research on this topic and some experience. But I think there's probably three things that I should focus on for this answer. The first thing is, you started to say sort of economic thought, and I was just thrilled as I started to do the research to find that pretty much most major Black African-American leaders throughout the long civil rights movement, so, you know, starting 1716, 1700s, but especially by the 20th century, most of them had something to say about cooperative economics for two major reasons. One, because economic survival has been such an issue, right? From being kidnapped and brought in chains to a new world, to not owning our own bodies, to then sort of owning our own bodies, but not being able to do anything or control anything, et cetera, et cetera. So just surviving has been an issue. And so most Black leaders have noticed that one of the ways we have survived is using all kinds of cooperation, including things like the Underground Railroad, which you can think of as an economic cooperation system, including shared kitchen gardens, and then now they're urban community gardens, that kind of thing, and then to actual, sharing equipment, tractors and equipment, sharing land, right? So all these things just to survive. But then it's also noticeable when you actually look at some of the speeches and writings, especially of Black leaders, but also what Black communities were doing. It was more than just surviving. It was about asserting ourselves as human beings and trying to practice economics in a way that recognized the dignity of our dignity as human beings, as workers, and our need to control land and resources. And so then again, cooperative ownership allowed us to do that, especially when we've had very little wealth accumulated, very little access to resources, right? We had to use whatever we had. And so that meant pooling it, and then agreeing that pooled resources would be a community asset, right? Something that all of us decided on what to do with it, how to do it. It didn't just become one person's fiefdom or a treasure, that kind of thing. So that's sort of the thought side. And I sometimes challenge people, name me a Black leader and I'll tell you something they did that had something to do with cooperative economics. And most of the time I can do it. I'm usually not stumped, though every now and then. For a while, I thought actually I was going to be stumped by Martin Luther King, except that he does talk about, poverty and injustice. But first, I thought he didn't have anything to do with any kind of co-ops, but then I found out he actually tried to start some credit unions. So anyway, then quickly, the next piece is about sort of how to do it within a racialized, capital, gendered system, right? Because it's one thing to say we need to do it and another thing to practice it informally, but how do we actually make it work as alternative systems that we can control, practice, and perpetuate? And that's where racism, again, right, created the need to do that, right, because of the exclusion and the discrimination and the exploitation, but also racism often hindered us. So most of the stories where the co-ops don't proceed or don't last as long as they should or could have or we wanted them to, and I'm trying not to use the word failure because most of the time they were sabotaged, not failed enterprises. But most of the time that they didn't last as long as one would think, even from an economic perspective, it was because of some level of sabotage, from very simple, banks colluding not to loan to a co-op, or the railroads colluding not to move the produce, to lynchings and burnings and white supremacist terrorism. So again, that second kind of issue. And I actually forgot my third point. So let me go, and I have these great panelists. Let me have them jump in here. And if I remember my third point, I'll come back.
Please do. Thank you. Would others like to jump in?
I could say something. I was
Yes,
hoping
please.
Marcelino will. Maybe you wanted Marcelino and then you turn off the mic when you wanted to open. I'm not really.
No, that's fine.
Nico, why don't you go ahead? We're not trying to do any set order here. So
Okay.
we'll do a flow.
So I just it's an interesting question for me because I think I'm just going to be more candid and talk about our experience of how we did things and what we learned. And so when we started, it was basically it was out of our work. It's like the other co-founder, she's also an academic. She's a Black sociologist that lives in Cambridge in UK. So we will do all this work when we were in Mexico in our holidays, and we will put money together and start inviting key people that we saw that they should be part of this conversation. So a lot of it was our own money and our own effort, and slowly we kind of, invited people that we saw that were key. And we did charge for it was like a volunteer thing, and it was enough to like pay the coffee and and actually we did try once. It's like, oh, you don't have to pay, bring whatever you can, and we end up like with 5 kilos of coffee and things like that. So we tried different things. So but what was interesting is that at some point it became clear that that was not sustainable because there was more demand. We needed to pay more time, not pay, but commit more time to the project. And I think as 3 women of color, it was really hard to figure out that we actually needed to charge and put value to our work. So that was really conflicting. And I could see how our own struggles, particularly like for the indigenous members of our collective was like, no, this is service. This is part of the community, And so it was a challenge. I don't know how else to put it. We still struggle in that area to kind of see ourselves. And it's hard because it's like your value is of how much you get paid, and we really want to go against that. But then on the other hand, does make sense to think that we need, that what we do is important, and that we need the conditions to be able to do what we need to do. So I think that's I don't have a solution for that, but it's kind of the balance between every member should be taken care, and also not and be able to give. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah,
You're talking about cooperative values, which I think are feminist values, right? And indigenous values that are really important.
yeah.
I think Marcelino wanted to speak as well.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
add a couple of points here. Well, cooperatives allow for ownership. And so we're talking about being able to collectively own a house or collectively own equipment. And people who might not otherwise have access to ownership, owning a house, now have an opportunity to go own a house. So it creates that possibility where we can own capital together, and we can pull our resources together and have an ownership experience within this capitalism, that is, within this capitalist system. And within our system that we now own, our housings, our shared housing, for example, we can also strive to create spaces for inclusion where marginalized identities now have ownership and have voices that can be heard within the governance structure of the system. So whereas in our capitalist system, we can be marginalized, silenced, invisibilized, now we have a structure where our voices count, they are heard, and they matter, and we are co-owners, and that's powerful. So we can share in the governance, and in sharing that governance, we can also strive to live into our social justice principles by, for example, one of our houses is named after Stephen Biko, and it is named as the People of Color House here in Isla Vista, which when that house was founded in particular, it was a very much predominantly white town. I mean, UCSB has diversified a lot since I was a student there. But at that time, and when I was a student there, which is when the Biko House was born, it was all white. And if you were a person of color, you were really, you stood out, because the multicultural center didn't even exist at that time. Mm-hmm. So the Stephen Biko House became a really significant place where we could have our ability to live into our social justice principles to mm-hmm. now have a house that is for people of color. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we have created houses that are LGBTQ houses, mm-hmm. where we strive to practice inclusion and give empowerment, really. It's about giving mm-hmm. access, giving tools for empowerment, leadership development opportunities that then, for example, the Biko House, during when COVID first hit us and we were being all economically impacted by COVID, the Biko House pushed for us to establish a resiliency fund so that people who have more resources could donate into a fund, and then people who are in need could apply for funding. And this is all member controlled. It's not being controlled by the staff. It's all being directed by the membership. But again, it's an opportunity for us to practice economic solidarity, economic democracy, and the structure of ownership is what empowers us to be able to do that. Check.
Yeah. This is important, right? And unless it's intentionally and deliberately structured into cooperatives, they may not deal with racial and intersectional justice. And I'm hoping, Marcelino, at some point you'll be able to talk about sociocracy, because what you're talking about is that the governance system of cooperatives can facilitate more equity, right? And Annalise, I don't know if you would like to weigh in on this one, or if we should turn to Tatia, who will talk about, who will ask questions about capitalism and democracy.
Yeah, we can move on. I have more to say maybe in the next juncture.
Tatia?
Thank you, Diane. I'm a little conflicted, I have to admit, because I do want this past the thing that we're talking about to continue for a little longer. So maybe I'll take over the baton, but I'll take it over on something that Diane just said, feminist principles. And maybe we can come back to feminist principles, because the thing I just realized, and this ties into the second question I wanted to ask, but the thing I realized is between Annalise, Emiko, what you were saying, Jessica, your work, there's a profoundly intentional effort to center specific, women's actions, their participation, whether it's Indigenous women, whether it's Black women. And my question isn't so much, I don't want to necessarily say women's participation in some of these movements, but what I want to say, what I want to do is rephrase the second question that we had kind of sent to you all, which is, what benefits have cooperative organizations produced while working under capitalism? But I want to rephrase this in feminist terms. And I'm wondering if you could give us, from your experience, an analysis of how, what kinds of feminist benefits have been produced by cooperatives under capitalism. Along what kinds of principles? What are some examples that you can think of? And just a quick word, I don't just mean cooperatives strictly, I do mean cooperative forms of social action, even if it's Indigenous forms of activist movements, forming collectives which are based on Indigenous philosophies, in any which way, but what benefits have they produced?
Okay, I'll jump in. And so I think one of the key things are talking about the feminist part of our work, which is not intentional. But one of the work we do is we do put a lot of attention on the part of healing from the effects of racism. And that's the key, that's the cornerstone of our work. And we are very careful that that process is in the core of the way we make decisions internally as a collective, that we don't leave anyone behind, and that we kind of work through process and work so we can have disagreements, and so I think there's that skill of we have disagreements and we move back and forth and we move slowly and everybody's listened to and taken into account. And sometimes, it's not peaceful. Sometimes it's frustrating, and, we've lost people in the way and we got new people. But I think there's something about that, embracing that is like, we know it's important, and we don't put it as a, now everybody talks about, oh, mental health and self-care is important. Now we put it in the center. We're like, we can't move. We just can't move this really difficult task if we don't put healing, and that means everybody in a collective working in this direction. And we do it internally as an organization, but we also do it as part of our interventions. So, and in terms of in terms of the democratic process that implies, is that it kind of gives a room to show struggles, to make mistakes and try to solve them. There's something about that I think when you're doing, I mean, my experience, I come from a communist household, and our experience was you were under siege and you had to be very rigid. Nobody could make a mistake. It was like you made a mistake and you're out, and the criticism, and I understand. I mean, you are under siege, you can't make mistakes because it can cost you your life or somebody else's life. So I think there's something that we've been trying to do here where it's kind of bringing us along as a group. And I mean, in our organizations, there are men, but I don't think an organization led by men would come up with this idea and insist and stay on it for 10 years.
Does anyone want to go next? Annalise, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I feel like that was an explicit shout out to me, so not necessarily, but I really appreciate it. So first of all, I just want to note that actually working with the matrilineal community in Northeast India right now, but because it's been almost 100% remote, I can't really say anything about what that looks like on the ground. And in fact, it's actually been quite difficult for a number of different reasons, because I've been working with a very masculinist, male-dominated sort of student organization. So we'll just sort of put that to the side for the moment. But I did have a tremendous opportunity to work with the indigenous Ainu community, or I shouldn't say the, but some components of, or some different organizations within the indigenous Ainu community in Japan, predominantly with women. And I think the first thing I would say is that they explicitly reject feminism. And they reject feminism because the name itself is associated with a particular kind of upper or middle class sort of majority ethnic Japanese women's sort of liberation movement, which is focused on things like pay for women for domestic labor and this kind of thing. I mean, this is a bit old school, but that's kind of the reputation that the word feminism, or this sort of association that women have with it in the Ainu community. And so when I did my field work about 10 years ago, it was not a very popular term. That said, the work that women are doing is very much focused on liberation of Ainu and access to indigenous rights as part of a broader Ainu community, but women recognize that their oppression as women cannot be separated from their identity as Ainu. So these two forms of oppression, it's very much an intersectional kind of sort of awareness that has been building for about the past 10 years or so. And they've been very involved with lobbying, for example, the United Nations, right? They've met with the CEDAW committee and whatnot. And so there's an increasing sort of critical awareness growing that we need to challenge these systems of oppression that push us down as women. And again, they're sort of fighting against this notion that you cannot expect to have attention to your issues as Indigenous women specifically. We have to first sort of band together and fight against the ethnic Japanese oppression first. Like there's this notion that you can't raise your voice as women and also fight against that at the same time. So rejection of this kind of intersectional politics. And just one more thing I wanted to say, and women are fighting back against that very strongly. I'm happy to report. The other thing I wanted to say is that there's, at the same time, there's a very quiet form of actually a kind of a very radical political work that's happening that connects with what Emiko was just saying about healing. And so as with many Indigenous communities and many marginalized communities, there are centuries of intergenerational trauma, which continue to bring them down. It's just so much pressure to even walk out in society and, you know, with pride, identify with your Ainu heritage, your Ainu ancestry. And one of the exciting things I was able to do is work with women's kind of like a cooperative organization. There were women's cloth work groups, and they would on a regular basis focus on some type of project and learn together and get together. And so it's essentially they were creating safe spaces within the community wherein women of all ages could get together and focus on an ancestral kimono and learn how to make the particular kind of embroidery, or learn how to weave the bast fiber for the cloth or what have you. There's a whole range of different techniques, but none of that was accessible to them in their quote unquote everyday life. They had to sort of learn this specialized knowledge, and those spaces became a space of healing because they were able to finally engage in dialogue with their ancestors no longer here, whose voices had been silenced and whose memories had been sort of hidden away to protect the living Ainu, because they knew that if their children and grandchildren went out into society and proudly, you know, sort of proclaimed their Ainu identity, that they would have rocks thrown at them or names called or all sorts of horrific racism. And so they had to create safe spaces within which they could engage with that indigenous epistemology and that different value system. So those are hopefully some examples that can kind of connect to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jessica, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Sure. So actually, I want to pick up on a couple of things, the caring that we heard about already, the safe spaces, the notion of women as sort of the bearers of culture and healing. And I found in the research I did on Black women in the mutual aid and cooperative movements that first, Black women also have that sense of intersectionality that Annalise was talking about, right? Knowing them, you know, that they're both of African descent and women, both statuses are the lowest of the low and treated with horrible indignities and exploitation, and that you can't really get out of either one without solving both of them together. So that often, again, meant you need, you know, economic solutions as well as political, civil rights, gender solutions, right? So they see, you know, that there's lots of periods in history where all those issues were connected. I think I mentioned in the keynote about the Knights of Labor in Richmond in the 1880s, how they were able to connect all those pieces and do it through a mission to start worker co-ops in particular. So we have that, but we also have a lot of the mutual aid movements and mutual aid societies in the US that were among African Americans were actually started by women. So at some points in history, you know, like 60 to 80% of Blacks were involved in some kind of mutual aid. And, you know, over half of them were started by and run by Black women. So there's that whole connection. Some of the women who were most active in the formal co-ops that get created actually started out being active in mutual aid and being, you know, leaders in their mutual aid association. So there's all those connections. And then, you know, I also started, the more you look at these things, you really see that women are, right, they're focused on survival and on sort of community organizing and using community organizing for survival. So again, that whole connection again, so economics for survival, but the right kind of economics for survival connected to community organizing and community empowerment. So that theme also runs through. The next theme I wanted to pull up a little bit was, you know, caring community and people-centered economics, right? Values-based economics. So again, women as helping us to both focus on caregiving, but also demanding recognition for caregiving. And I'm sensitive to what Emiko said earlier, that in some ways they didn't want to, you know, they didn't want to be paid for it or recognized in a capitalist sense for the caregiving, but they did want to be able to continue to do their caregiving. And again, the cooperative collective economics mutual aid allows you to be more focused on people, right? People caring, to put value on caring in different ways, and to, you know, in feminist economics, that's one of the main pieces, elements of it, right, is the making invisible work visible and then giving it value that it doesn't normally have. And so I think, again, co-ops, Black women's roles in co-ops allow that. The fourth, I think I'm on fourth, this time I wrote stuff down. The work-life balance. I also noticed, especially in worker co-ops, and agricultural co-ops, but co-ops and mutual aid, again, have allowed women to have that kind of balance, right? To be a worker, to do labor, to be in the labor force, but also to do the stuff you want to and need to do at home and in your communities. And a co-op allows you to sort of do all that in a much more balanced way and to be recognized for all those roles. So again, those connections. And finally, the safe spaces. I was actually going to bring that up to go back to the racial justice question, but I think the safe spaces that collaboratives, cooperatives, cooperative ownership can, right? We can create liberated spaces, safe spaces to do the kind of work and economics that we want to do as a people and as a community. for African Americans, also the co-ops gave us safe spaces to agitate for our civil rights. So I know there's actually a housing co-op sort of guru in the U.S. named David Thompson. I don't know, some of you might know him because I think he was at Berkeley for years. He actually is in the middle of writing a book on the role that housing co-ops played in the civil rights movement. And what he found was the safe space that housing co-ops provided for African Americans actually gave them places to literally plan civil rights activities, especially like he uses the March on Washington. A. Philip Randolph lived in a housing co-op most of his life in Harlem, right? There were a bunch of other housing co-ops, and literally being able to be quiet and safe in those housing co-ops to plan these things that most people considered, treasonous or whatever was just important. So that, just that physical safe space in addition to the safe space of, right, being a liberated space for all these kinds of economic activities and social and political that we're talking about. So I think raising all those areas, and that means that women are integral in that, but it's also about human beings and allowing human beings to be human beings.
Thank you so much to all of you for just indulging that segue. I had more questions about knowing your enemy, which is capitalism, but we don't have time for that. So I'll hand this over to Casey, who has questions on research, and if we have time, we will come back to questions on social policy. But Casey.
Thank you, Tatya, and thank all the panelists for this amazing and very stimulating discussion. So exciting to hear your thoughts. So these set of questions are about the place of research in the praxis of building cooperatives. Thought and action go together in any intentional effort to build communities and build relationships, especially against the strong winds of capital, state, terror, etc. So I guess I'd like to ask you to reflect. There's a lot of questions here, but if I could boil it down to one, that would be it. The reflections on, and perhaps using examples from your own work and experience, reflections on the role of research and study in the process of building, sustaining, and growing cooperatives. I'll pass the word on to whoever would like to take that on first.
Well, it's another one of my specialties, but I realized we didn't hear from Marcelino, so I don't know if he wants to start.
Well, Jessica, I'd rather hear from you first.
Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. So the first thing is that I think I've said this before, but most of the Black co-ops that I found anything about, I found they started with a study group. And so that sense of research and learning together seems, at least by the 20th century, and probably even before that, to be extremely important to both how you operate as a, intentional community of decision makers, and how you learn enough about an alternative system that isn't really talked about and is definitely not taught in your society, right? So you're doing both at the same time. You're learning about something that people don't talk about, and in some ways were taboo, right? You actually had to talk about it at night behind closed doors so that you wouldn't be called a communist or be run out of town or whatever. And also the learning together is what helps to create the trust and the system of solidarity that builds the kinds of systems everybody's been talking about that work, right? Because they don't work if you can't figure out how to work together, how to make decisions together, how to learn together, because these are all learning. We're talking about being in learning organizations that are continuing to evolve. So having the space giving the time, having the space, having the understanding about how important it is to learn together. And some of these learning circles and community groups actually doing research. Like I've actually found that, you know, a group in Chicago actually went to the co-op in Gary, Indiana, and asked them questions and studied what they'd done. Another group actually went to the Antigonish movement in Nova Scotia from the US, like in the 1930s, right? Because they knew there was stuff they needed to learn about what people were already doing, how people were already doing it, that they want to do. So just a rich, rich history of that kind of co-learning and all that it means. But also in my own life, you know, I got interested in cooperative economics as a community economic development tool, both as a research topic, but also as an activist. And one of the things I realized, and I kind of, before I knew the term sort of participatory action research and social action research and that kind of thing, it turned out I was sort of doing it because what I was doing was I was being a co-op activist because I believed it was the kind of structures and systems that we as a society should be doing more of. But I was also looking at the activities I was doing and the groups I was meeting with and the things we were trying to advocate for and looking at, well, what don't we know enough about, right? One of the things, I went to a conference where they were talking about how co-ops help people, you know, reduce costs, raise incomes, and create wealth. And so I was like, well, how do we really know that, right? And so here I am as an economist, right? How do you prove that, right? So then I started studying it myself and figuring out what are the ways to study it, because I also, as an economist, got a little frustrated because some people were using a broad term of wealth and economists have a very narrow term of net worth, right? So then I also worked with a sociologist who we said, okay, we want to look at economics, with the way that economics define wealth, but we also want to look at the broader notion of wealth, right? Human and societal wealth and that kind of thing. So that got me into studying what credit unions were doing and how to measure benefits beyond just the immediate ones, like how much income or how many jobs are being produced and that kind of thing. And so just being in the movement led me to also start to have research questions that I could follow through on, which would also help the movement, but would also help me understand the systems better and be able to explain them and describe them better. So that kind of co-learning, right? Me as a researcher, but I'm also learning with and for the movement, but I'm also trying to make sure we have materials that will help to sell, right, to market the movement.
Great. That makes me want to tack on an additional question, maybe on a second round if we have time, which is, what right now is the pressing research question for movements around the world at this juncture in history? So we could leave that, everyone could think about that a little bit after they're answering the first question. Maybe we can get to it as well. Does anybody else have a response that was from the field?
I can chime in now. This is Marcelino. So yeah, I think you said it so well there, Jessica. And just to piggyback on what you were saying there, we need to figure out, these systems don't work if we can't figure out how to work together. So the metaphor I would use for a cooperative is that you have to fly the plane while learning how to operate the plane while meeting the needs of everybody on board the plane, because we have to work together to meet everybody's needs. That is the purpose of the cooperative. And yet we still have to figure out how to operate as a structure, as an organization. And part of the challenges for organizations and cooperatives that I think is a really good area of research in terms of praxis is, how do cooperatives do shared governance? What decision-making structures really work well, and what decision-making structures have been tried and have not worked so well? So in our capitalist system, we're very used to Robert's Rules of Order. We're very used to hierarchical systems, and we're not familiar with alternatives to that. So we can venture into a cooperative enterprise, and in absence of a model to follow, we have to struggle along to learn it. And while we're doing that, we sometimes could even re-perpetuate the tyranny of capitalism within our structures, so that we're perpetuating the oppressions that we sought to liberate ourselves from, because they're unconscious, they're implicit, they're in our bodies and how we've been shaped by capitalism. So there is a need for this ongoing education for us as well, that we have to continue to learn together in order to build this trust. And I think that really speaks to the need for us to develop emotional intelligence across the spectrum of all the members of the cooperative, because you're going to have an intergenerational spectrum. You're going to have people from a diverse set of backgrounds. And we've all experienced capitalism. People have been traumatized by capitalism more so than others. And so there's the need for the healing space in order for us to grow and work through what we have experienced, and at the same time come into our voice, come into our power, and develop our own emotional intelligence in order to work well with others, so that we can work together for the whole. One of the struggles that cooperatives are currently tackling is in response to Black Lives Matter, right? Organizations have been issuing statements in response to Black Lives Matter, in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. The credit unions have gone further than just that. They have sought to incorporate an 8th cooperative principle into the international cooperative principles. And some of the organizations that I work with through Sociocracy, we've really been looking at, we don't want just a statement, we want actionable items. We have to have these statements as mission statements, and then we've got to set goals about how we're going to enact these in the short term, in the mid-range, and the long range. But we have to follow it up with action. So I think that's one of the places where co-ops are being challenged right now, is to address diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, yeah. So thank you so much, Jack.
Such an exciting challenge. Thankfully, we have a long history of other examples of people who have been working on this, so we can gain from. But every moment in history throws up new challenges and new social formations. Does anybody have an additional comment, Annalise or Emiko, from your experience? Can you bring an example of how research shapes the actions of cooperative building?
Emiko, did you want to say something? I don't want to talk over you. Okay, I think she's saying go ahead. Thank you. So yeah, I'll just say very quickly, because I'm still very much in the middle of trying to figure out what this is going to look like. But so I'm in the midst of a cooperative project right now, working with a group of Indigenous community members who are part of this. It's called a student organization, but it's really just a sort of big, it's kind of a cooperative economic kind of system, although they see themselves as more supporting education, rural development, sort of empowerment, this kind of thing. And so that organization is involved in a community research project right now. We're looking at public health impacts from pilot uranium mining that was done in the early 90s, but unfortunately the waste has been handled very poorly, and it's just kind of thrown out, dumped in the forest. And right now we believe that it's polluting the water supply. There's a health crisis. I mean, it should essentially be a Superfund site if such things existed in India. They do not, to my knowledge, but at any rate, so this community has kind of been sort of plotted as a massive sacrifice zone for the nuclear energy, quote unquote, sort of in industry, but in fact, it's not really energy per se. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but it's very controversial, a very extremely sensitive area. And so my field team is essentially risking their lives every day, going out, meeting with communities and trying to find out what's happening on the ground. What I can say about this in terms of collaborative work and cooperative knowledge, shared knowledge, is that all that we knew about what was happening in these communities was the very, very scant number of publications. I mean, it was just really limited. And so essentially for us, the entire research process has been rooted in learning together. We had to sort of transform our approach, adjust the questions, adjust the way that we did this at every stage as new things sort of came up. And how does this contribute to sort of broader cooperative research kind of work? I've been very much committed to an engaged model of scholarship for a long, long time. And I believe that, so I'm trained in anthropology, and I came up in anthropology at a time when indigenous sort of decolonial frameworks were just coming onto the scene. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to take some courses before I graduated, because now now there's all sorts of incredible work coming out. And essentially I feel that as anthropologists, as ethnographers, and really any field that we're involved in, we can't really do this work unless we sit down and have conversations with communities first. What are their needs? What are the potential benefits for them? And if there is not some sort of shared benefit at the end of the day, you're very likely to get a no, get the door slammed in your face. And so essentially, I feel like we have to find ways of building partnerships at the beginning. It's really tricky in terms of grad students getting funding for their research, for example, but I feel like we can't really continue to exist as a discipline, as a sort of research capitalist enterprise, right? Unless we find ways to sort of transform the way that we do our work. And so this is a process, again, it's very experimental, it's very ongoing, trying, especially, doing your human subjects reviews and all of those sort of components. But at the end of the day, I'm trying to find ways that it can be productive for the community. And so we hope to, for example, construct hazard maps and educate these communities and let them know about, which areas are, risky to what degree and which areas are safer. But also the key is that you have to educate people so that they can make informed decisions, not simply red zone, green zone kind of thing. It has to be much more nuanced than that. And so this is a process of co-learning. I'm learning as they're learning, and we're all sort of challenging what we know at the beginning. And I think we're going to end up in a very different space at the end. But right now with COVID, everything is kind of in a holding pattern. So yeah, just some thoughts about how we approach the research process. Thank you so much.
That's great. Right, learning and unlearning sort of at the same time. Emiko, would you like to?
Yeah, I come from, as I say at the beginning, I'm not studying cooperatives, and that was not mine. So I'm just doing it without no training or studying, or maybe I should read, Jessica's book and learn of all the things I should have not done. But one thing I can say about research is like when I conceived this collective, I wanted to have a collective that had different legs. So I wanted academia, research, and I wanted NGOs, and I didn't have any connections with any particular movement, but that was the goal. And so at the beginning, we did started with that. We had an organization, this is a human rights organization that basically gave us the entrance to work with human rights activists. And then they decided not to work with us. We were too slow for them. That was very interesting. They were like, we need to have and we're like, what do you mean I have to turn in tomorrow? I am grading. I can't do, So that was part of learning, like the timing and the process. But we end up doing these workshops with very different type of people. So, and it was the challenge of how do we bring what we know, thinking about them, that makes sense for them. So I think one of the most important, like we did this workshop that first was for human rights, activists that have whole level of, legal talk and all that. That for us was a learning. But then we end up, I don't know how we got invited to go to the Costa Chica, which is the western part of the western coast in Mexico, where most of Black population live there. And this was an organization of peasant teachers and fisher women organization. It was a very diverse. And we were there our goal is to motivate social activists to include a racial perspective to their work. That's what we're trying to do. And so we talk to anyone who wants to talk to us. But what has been interesting is that as we like, oh shoot, we don't have anything about gender. We don't have anything about, you know. So in that process, we are challenged to think about like, what's the issue? No, well, environmental racism. Oh, I don't know anything about environmental racism. So we end up bringing people in order for them to, and then we become like the person who helps them. How to these academic super trained people? How can they actually move the, present the work? And so it's been a very interesting process of how to bring our research and learn from the issues. So it's a co-learning, as Annalise is saying, but also on the larger spectrum, as me as a scholar, what happened, for example, when we went there, we got furious for noticing certain things, like basically was mestizo and men who were talking about Black women. And we got furious. So my colleague and I, we decided to do a research about women, Black women in the West Coast. So I don't know how to put it. It's like, and it's this collaboration where you're having these conversations that you build. I think I'm talking more about what it is activist research than it has to be collaborative, but it's fun. I recommend it. Highly recommend it.
So dynamic and constantly changing. It's an ongoing process of learning to confront new issues.
I just remember what I wanted to say about your question about capitalism and the challenge to this. So what we noticed, because we didn't know, we walked into this NGO world where there is all this machinery. So the way we got hired is a secondary NGO had been given money to do workshops for indigenous and Black women. And they like, So they gave it to us and we went. So, and that's a problem, And I think that's what we try not to do. We don't want to be this machinery where everybody kind of is reproducing, oh, we have to empower women, here we go, So and that's a problem and that's a challenge. And I think it's been, what I would say, people who are like the recipients of these workshops, most of them are very critical about it. But because of the economical situations where they are, it is difficult for them to say no, because it's a possibility of networking. It's a possibility of learning something that might be useful for them, and there's that's how they kind of test the waters. There are other organizations that are stronger and they can say, no, they can choose. But I'm talking to where like the people we work with, most of them are, not all, but some of them are really like, they don't, I don't know. They're not necessarily in a place where they can set tone of what needs to happen. So that's a big problem of how the capitalism, neoliberal use of, social welfare and, empowerment, leadership, all those things. We just presented a proposal, and we work with a group of Black and indigenous leaders from Latin America. And the first thing they say, we are not going to use the word leadership and we're not going to use the word empowerment. It's like we're done with those two words, So anyway, it just is a broader question, but I think that's a big challenge for any of this type of work, how capitalists have corrupted this work.
Right. Yeah. There's sort of a development industry that has sort of taken over these sorts of projects. I'm going to pass the word to Alice, because Alice has a lot of really amazing questions from the chat box. And then I think we can sort of get more down in the weeds about what research needs to happen. So Alice, go ahead.
I do. There are quite a number of questions. And I'm very much picking up on what we've just been talking about. I have to add, I think what we've just been talking about is a really big challenge to this project, and we have a lot to think about. How do we, and this is not about us modeling anything. It's about us learning how to generally co-create and co-learn. So in that spirit, there are a number of questions that relate to things that are on students' minds in particular. And I will reaffirm here that students are very much the people we want to engage in our research process. So I'm going to raise some of those. One is a set of questions about the housing cooperative movement in particular, locally, but generally speaking. And what is it that, the question was framed about what UCSB can do, but I would say, what can we collectively do as a community? And specifically, is there a research agenda or a co-created research agenda around what can be done to expand student, but maybe more generally, housing cooperatives in our community? I think now, Marcelino, I am looking at you because I think you'd be a great person to start us off on that line of thinking.
I think the first thing I'll say is that if there is a student out there who is not currently a member of our housing co-ops and is very interested in cooperatives, I encourage you to apply to be a member of our housing co-ops, because we could use your initiative and what you would bring to the organization. Stronger when we have students who are really committed to the values of cooperation, living in the cooperatives and helping us to do this together, because it is a collective effort. So that's the first thing. What can we do to support cooperatives as a community? We really have a need for community members who have experience in the nonprofit realm, in the professional realm, who really understand how nonprofits work in our capitalist society, to help us, to be an advisory board, to sit as board members, to provide mentoring, to provide guidance to our student-led board, essentially. So it is a really valuable educational experience for our students, and there's an opportunity for somebody who wants to see these structures thrive in our community to work alongside students who are doing this work with the support of staff, of course. So I would encourage that. In terms of what the university can do, there is the community land trust model. We haven't spoken about the community land trust model yet, but cooperatives have been moving towards the community land trust model, where land is dedicated for a specific purpose. So for example, if the university had land that it could allocate to housing, it could designate it as a community land trust. And that land trust would then be dedicated to cooperative housing, and then cooperative housing could come up there, and then it could be student-run cooperative housing. So if the students wanted to push for that, that is something that the university could certainly do in our area, and Santa Barbara Student Housing Co-ops would be happy to help build that cooperative venture. Because there's a lot more that goes into building the housing cooperative than just having the house. You have the house, and now you've got to build the interior structures of how the members are going to work together. So that was the other thought I had there. I think that's it. I think I lost my other thought. Check.
Okay, great. Well, a question that's related to that, one question did come up about not just land trust. I mean, I think there are all sorts of models for developing housing that just never get talked about. The land trust certainly being one of them. Others are various ways of pooling income and creating mechanisms for joint acquisition of property, because after all, we are working within a capitalist system. So if anyone cares to comment on that. But I wanted to raise a somewhat related question that also has to do with students that has came a few different ways, which is, how does the cooperative model work with with one question, with a mobile population? When membership is continuously shifting. That seems to, a few questions came up about this. This seems to create some dilemmas for the cooperative model, but from an organizational standpoint, and yet you're still trying to serve a population that is inherently mobile. So that I would open that question up for anybody, for for thoughts about how cooperatives have managed that tension.
Yeah, I was actually going to jump in a little bit about housing co-ops also. So I think I can answer both the last question and this one. So my first thought in terms of talking just about housing co-ops was to piggyback on what Marcelina already said, but the sustainability and anti-liberalism. And actually all co-ops have both problems, right? But student housing has it a lot. Housing co-ops often have it. Worker co-ops can have it. And what do I mean by that? So first, let me do the anti-liberalism because the sustainability goes also to the second question. My daughter actually is one of the co-founders of a housing co-op when she was in college, CHUM, Cooperative Housing of University of Maryland, and she was trained by NASCO. She was actually president twice in her college career of CHUM. And one of the things they found, which I think also happens out in the real world, not just with student housing co-ops, is that people get drawn to the model because of the affordable housing and not necessarily because of the solidarity economics and the economic democracy. And so you get people who want the cheaper housing, but don't necessarily want to do the shared governance. And so she struggled, I think her co-op struggled in the first 2 or 3 years with what do you do with people who won't follow the house rules, who won't come to the meetings, who don't want to be a part of shared governance. You know, everybody's liberal about it in terms of no one wants to throw anybody out or vote anybody off the island or whatever. And yet the organization can't really function if you don't have people who agree to the shared rules and who do, right? So, you know, they spent years, as I said, training with NASCO about how to deal with this, but also trying to come up with their own policies. And so some of it was just in terms of research, right? Just where can you find, right, best policies for, right? What do you do with slackers? What do you do, right? How do you get rid of student members, right? One of the things they didn't want to do was say to someone, you can't stay in the co-op, but put them out in the middle of the semester, right? Because then they don't have any housing and you're not. So then, they finally ended up with some rules about conduct and expectations. And if you don't meet them, you're not asked to renew, right? So you can't be kicked out in the middle of a semester, but you're not asked to renew the next year or the next semester, that kind of, and that took them 3 years to actually pass laws like that because everybody just thought it was so cruel, right? Until they realized they couldn't run their co-op, right? So there's that kind of, right? I think understanding better liberalism, especially, co-op people tend to be sort of liberal in that sense. There's also liberalism issues just on the race stuff too, right? Some co-ops will not recognize their racism and their racist microaggressions because they're like, oh, we believe in co-ops, we're progressives, and they don't see how they can be both a progressive and still have white privilege or whatever. So there's that issue. And as I said, it rolls off into others. And I know one of the groups I work with in Washington, D.C. on creating housing co-ops, it's also a problem, right? How do you get people who really joined up because they didn't want to be displaced from their home and they didn't want to be gentrified, but then now they're in a housing co-op and they need to step up, right? So I think those issues. Then the sustainability, I found it really interesting. And I think, Marcelina, you actually alluded to this earlier. You do have a lot of turnover, right? Within a year or two, and definitely within 4 years or whatever, 4 or 5 years, you have new, almost new co-ops all the time. I also study youth co-ops and Black youth co-ops. And one of the things that they were able to do is they recognized that people were going to grow up or, finish high school or leave the after school program that they were in because they got older or whatever. They ended up with a really strong orientation and training program for the newcomers, right? So one of the Food from the Hood in LA, right? They literally would start work, the seniors would work with the 9th graders, right? Start to market the co-op, start to talk with them, bring them in, buddy up with them, give them little tasks, right? Get them ready so that by the time the seniors were leaving, they already knew they had, sophomores and juniors who would be able to move up, who already understood what was going on, who had been trained by them. So very deliberate, sort of built-in orientation and training. When you come on, you understand that, right, that this is going to be a strong part of the model. And so I also, I also found the same thing with worker co-ops in general, not that they have as much turnover, but they need to keep bringing in new people, especially if they grow. And the same thing, the stronger worker co-ops were the ones that really paid attention to orientation and training and buddying people up and making sure that people were prepared for the next steps, the next roles, and defining leadership in multiple ways so that people could step up in ways that were comfortable to them, either their circumstances, their personality, whatever, and people seeing leadership like multiple forms of leadership. And so I think more research even on multiple forms of leadership in co-ops could be very important for all of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you're talking, I mean, I'm thinking too about ways in which people who move on from any particular cooperative can remain engaged and do remain engaged and continue to support cooperative, and not just cooperative principles, but actual cooperatives. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this whole set of questions, whether it's with regard to student engagement in particular, or this whole question of shifting populations and questions of membership? If not, and this is partly because I'm mindful of time. We're a little bit over and we have so much more to talk about. But because we are coming to our sort of wrap up moment, I'm going to invite Charlie Hale, who was slated to kind of offer a couple of wrap up comments. Instead, he has raised a very interesting and generative question in the chat box, so I'm going to invite him to ask it.
Good evening, everyone. This has been an amazing dialogue. I really appreciate, very much appreciate Jessica's return presence from afar, and also the really great participation from a variety of perspectives and experiences, which I think is definitely what this cooperative, I guess it is cooperative economics or study of cooperatives initiative needs. We have anthropology, history, sociology, ethnic studies, and an emphasis, I would say, on kind of the post-discipline area as a questioning of the boundaries rather than history. Did I mention history? Questioning of the boundaries rather than remaining within those rather limiting and often unhelpful disciplinary boundaries. It's really great to have the questions coming from so many different angles and focusing on everything from self-care to intersectional justice to the broader issues of how cooperatives are really about restructuring relationships and then creating sustainable alternatives to the oppressive and unacceptable, noxious and problematic relationships that are produced by our current system. And so it's very exciting to see this broadened dialogue. Having said that, I also, and this is a guess, and I may be wrong, but I think probably Jessica is the only economist in the room or in the Zoom room. And that makes it even more wonderful, Jessica, for you to be present. And also raises an interesting question about your home discipline, Jessica. You referred to that a little bit in your earlier remarks. But more centrally, the question is about economic analysis or political economic analysis as a component of this emergent, very exciting program in teaching and praxis on cooperatives. So how important is that component of our analysis? How can we do it without economists? Should we be recruiting economists? Are there economists? How many Jessica Gordon Nemharts are there out there that are doing economic analysis with the kind of perspective that we are trying to build? But I think it also relates to Tatya's question about knowing the enemy. What does our work on cooperatives need to understand about capitalism in order to create the kind of economically viable and radically people-centered cooperative alternatives? And I actually had forgotten that Alice asked me to make concluding remarks. My concluding remarks are, this has been a wonderful dialogue, and instead I posed a question, so if we're over time, we can leave it hanging, or just leave it for a follow-up session, of which I hope there will be many. And I'm really excited to see the proposals that come in. We're so excited to be funding research and activist research in this area, and I know it's going to grow and become a signature UC Santa Barbara program.
Well, I really want to echo that final sentiment about research proposals coming in, but I also want to say, the question of capitalism, it is often the elephant in the room. I mean, not for us, we bring it up all the time, but the reality is that right now, these cooperative initiatives that we look at and we study are operating within a capitalist system that seems structured against them on fundamentally different principles, and yet they survive and they work within it, even as some at least attempt to say we're trying to create an alternative. So I think that question of what is it that we need to know to elevate that questions is one of the central challenges that we face. So it's a really big question, but if anyone has any parting thoughts or any kind of thoughts about that question, it might be a good way to close out.
I can say something about economists. Because that came up, but I really think that there's some need to take political economy back from the economists, and I think we need to go back to that 18th century separation. Economics is liberal and bourgeois, political economy is radical, and I think we have to kind of seize it back. There's some need to seize it back, and I think all of these philosophical questions about reciprocity, learning and unlearning, study groups, I think these are all part of political economic thinking. You can't do a critique of systems if you don't study every night, every evening. It's, workers produce the sharpest critiques of capitalism while doing union work, while studying every evening. So I think there's a principle of lived political economy that happens on the ground. Questions of philosophy that are central to political economy that have been lost by economists taking over the space of political economy. So I think there's a seizing back that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I would agree with that, though I have to tell you that, my PhD is actually in political economy from the renowned graduate program in political economy, and I did not learn cooperative economics there. They now actually have a certificate in cooperative economics, thanks to some of my co-op practitioner people in the Valley there. But no, I actually am self-taught as a cooperative economist, but I do agree with you that we need political economy to talk about cooperative economics, and we need to wrestle political economy away from neoclassical and mainstream economics. The other thing I would say is, I was very happy at John Jay to have the title, Community Justice and Social Economic Development, because I really do believe that this study of solidarity economics and cooperative economics is really about social economic development. It's really the social political and economic. And so I think for co-ops, we have to have everything, right? We've got to be interdisciplinary because there's so many different forces, impacts, and benefits that co-ops have. If you only even look at the economic benefits, you're missing so much. And that was one of when I started trying to measure and study the economic benefits and impacts of cooperatives, I found that it was actually very limiting, that you couldn't really talk about leadership development. You couldn't talk about all the stuff we talked about caring, creating caring communities and balancing work and life if you were just looking at the economic impacts. However, you couldn't really explain or talk about or understand the system or figure out what policies are needed to support the system if you didn't understand the economic mechanisms and how the economic pieces work. So we really need all of it. There are some people out there doing cooperative economics who are economists. There are some people who are interested in this and being trained. They're hard to find, but they are out there. But you might, another thing you might do in the next 5 years is think about a certificate in cooperative economics that you could offer your undergrads, because that could be an interesting, and again, the broader sense of cooperative political economy or solidarity in cooperative economics or something like that. I know we're out of time. This is another topic I could talk about for hours, so I'll stop there.
Okay. And I think that's a great note, especially with that very excellent idea about a certificate in cooperative economics. So I'm going to once again end by inviting all the undergraduates out there to be part of the first cohort that we will at least give a virtual certificate in cooperative economics by not just applying, but just continuing to be engaged in these conversations that we are definitely going to continue, inspired by this really fantastic set of things that we've been able to put on with the help of all of our panelists and friends. So thank you very much to everyone, and looking forward to, as I said before, continuing the conversation.